Church. It's nice to see you all this morning as we celebrate the communion today. What a special Sabbath it is for us to remember what Jesus has done for us. And I've called today's topic the full extent of his love. And it's interesting, the passage we're going to look at today is in John chapter 13. But before we go to John chapter 13, I want to invite you to pick up your Bibles and turn with me to 1 John. That's the Epistle of John right near the back, near Revelation. The Epistle of John. And we want to look at the second chapter of the Epistle of John. And I'm going to start in verse 7. So, first Epistle of John, chapter 2, first Epistle of John, chapter 2 and verse 7. And it says there, "Brethren, I write a new commandment to you, but an old commandment, which you have had from the beginning. The old commandment is the word which you heard from the beginning." Who finds that a confusing verse? Put up your hand. I'm glad a couple of you find that's a confusing verse, because I remember coming across that and I thought to myself, so is it a new one or is it an old one? What's the actual difference between this new commandment and this old commandment? And I believe that our study in John 13 today is going to reveal to us why Jesus calls it a new commandment. Because we're going to finish in John 13 with this verse here. So turn over to John chapter 13 with me. And we're going to remain now in John chapter 13. John chapter 13, that's the Gospel of John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Gospel of John, chapter 13 and verse 34. Verse 34, Jesus speaking says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another." And what we're going to find today is the key to this new commandment is to love as Jesus loved. The reason why it was an old commandment, because it always existed. The reason why it was a new commandment is because Jesus showed how to love. And our passage in John 13 today, it starts with, in verse 1 it says, "Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come, that he should depart from the world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end." Or I love how the New International Version says it showed him the full extent of his love. In other words, Jesus here, through what is going to happen here, showed them the full extent of his love. Now I remember when I was a young fella, back when I was around about 19 years of age, I was a little bit experienced with the ladies, and a few people laughing, I don't know why. But I remember asking this girl out. She lived in Wagga, I lived in Albury, but I was moving to Port Macquarie, and I thought she was a little bit out of my league, but she said yes. And we started dating, and things were going really well. But then I moved to Port Macquarie, and she moved up she came up and visited me up there, and things were going well. And we talked about future visits and how this was all going to work with this long distance relationship. And I thought things were going great. And then, it was her birthday, and I had some friends in Wagga, and they were giving me a little bit of coaching, and said, it's this person's birthday. I know we've got some Wagga people here, so I'm not going to say names or anything. But it's this person's birthday, and you should give her something for her birthday. Oh, yeah, I never consider that. That's how green I was. So what do? What do I give her? Well, I'll give her a single rose in a cylinder. That would be pretty special, hey? And a red one at that. And so I got one, and I organised it and got it sent to her, and she thanked me back for that rose, and I thought things were going well. Then I heard from the friends in Wagga that this girl on this particular day got 12 red roses and long-stemmed red roses from this other guy there. And I started to hear a little bit more about this other guy, but I wasn't too concerned because I'd just spent some time with her, and we were spending some time at Christmas time, and I kept hearing about how he was. They actually went out to a meal together, and it was the most expensive place in Wagga that he took her. And he was showering her with gifts and all these things, and I wasn't too concerned. But then a week before she was due to arrive in Port Macquarie, where I was staying, I got notice to say, I don't think I'm going to come up. I don't think it's going to work. And later on I found that this other fella who was showering more gifts than me got her love. That's why I showered my wife with plenty of gifts before she would actually accept me. So I had learned. But you know, when I look at it and I look back now, I think to myself, we get this concept of love that if we love somebody enough, they will love us back. Is that right? Is that how it's meant to be? Yes. But that's the concept of human love. But what Jesus shows here is that it's completely different. In verse 1 where he says here, he loved them to the end. This love is the agape love. This is the most pure love that can be shown to anybody. And I love how John introduces this scene. He tells us it's the time of the Passover, which puts in our mind that this is the time that the Jews celebrated their deliverance from the bondage of sin, or the deliverance from the bondage of Egypt through the blood of the Lamb. It pointed to the time when Jesus would come and that he would die for them. And so John wants us to know that this is the time of the Passover. This was when Jesus instituted this communion service. Straight away after that, it tells us, and supper being ended in verse 2, the devil having already put in the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand, that he had come from God and was now going to God, rose from supper, laid aside his garments and took a towel and girded himself. It's interesting how it introduces Judas here. Not only Judas, it tells us that it was Judas, Simon's son. Later on in verse 6, there's another Simon that's going to be introduced. Simon Peter. And it's interesting that John chooses to call them both Simons. A Simon's son and a Simon Peter. John wants to see this contrast between these two guys. One was going to betray Jesus. The other was going to deny Jesus. What were the other disciples doing? Well, before this event, they were actually arguing who was going to be the greatest. Who was going to sit on the right, who was going to sit on the left, and they're jostling for positions, and they've just missed the whole point of who Jesus was. And while they're doing that, Jesus shows them the full extent of his love. While they're carrying on like that, ready to deny, ready to betray, Jesus gets up and begins to wash his disciples' feet. As he was washing, it tells us in verse 5, and I can just imagine he's going through the disciples and he gets to Peter. And in verse 6 he says to Simon Peter, and Peter said to him, Lord, are you washing my feet? This is one of those rhetorical questions. This is one of those things that it wasn't really a question. This was really, you're not going to do that, are you? Really? My feet? Now, to put us in context, we get a little bit of help from the other chapters, from the other Gospels, because we find that in Luke, that two disciples were sent to prepare the Passover meal. Who were they? Call them out. Peter and John. Peter and John. Peter and John were actually sent to prepare the meal. So in preparing for this Passover meal, they were to organise somebody to wash the feet of those travellers that came, of the disciples that came. Now, I don't know what went on, and it doesn't tell us what went on, but I can just imagine what about the washing of the feet? What are we going to do when they come in? Well, we'll see if the owner's got somebody, but the owner's not going to be here. Well, we're all here together anyway. We're all going to come together, so we'll maybe just forget about that service. We'll just put the feet washing aside. And the feet washing didn't happen. Because the meal had happened, and then afterwards we find that Jesus gets up and begins to wash the disciples' feet. So as he's getting up and he's washing and he comes to Peter, Peter's now I feel he's actually probably racked with guilt. I can just go, well, I should have done this. I should have got someone, but I wasn't prepared to say that I'm the lowest in the group. Jews actually like Gentiles to do this service for them because they didn't even like doing it themselves. But Jesus got down on his hands and knees in front of his disciples and he started to wash their feet. Remember, John say he's showing them now the full extent of his love. He's loving them all the way to the end. When he knows that he's on his own in this part of the journey, he's got to face the hardest road he's ever trod. And he does it without God's help because he's separated from God by our sins. And he's thinking about the ones that he loved. He's not thinking about himself, he's thinking about the ones that he loved, the ones that he was with on this earth. So Jesus says, you don't understand what I'm doing now, but you will understand and know after this. And then in verse 8, Peter says to him, you shall never wash my feet. You know, this word for never is the strongest word in the Greek language. Peter was absolutely adamant that this was not going to happen. He knew the culture of the day. He knew that this was a demenial task and that this should not be done by him, let alone by his Lord. And so he was not going to allow this to happen until Jesus answered him and said, if I do not wash you, you have no part in me. All of a sudden, from Peter's adamant, you will never wash my feet, he changes to, well, Lord, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well, and everything. Just do whatever. You know, to me, this really shows that Peter's got one thing right. What's the one thing he's got right? He doesn't want to be separated from Jesus. You know, if we only get one thing right today, let it be that we don't want to ever be separated from Jesus. I pray that we will make that our main purpose. Whatever it takes, I'm going to do that not to be separated from Jesus. And Peter here is, whatever it takes, Lord, wash me all, because I don't want to be separated from you. And then Jesus says this sort of a bit of a weird saying. He says, he who has had a bath only needs to wash his feet, but is completely clean, and you are clean, but not all of you. For he knew who would betray him, therefore he said, you are not all clean. This is interesting. What does it mean that they were clean? What does it mean that he has had a bath only needs to wash his feet? This here is talking about baptism. They had been baptised. They had committed themselves to Jesus. But were there some things that needed addressing in their own lives? There certainly were, Lucas. There were some things that needed addressing in their own life, and if they weren't prepared to address those things, then they could have no part in Jesus. This is telling us is if we are choosing to sin above having God in our lives, fully in our lives, that we will be separated from him. But he who has had a bath, he who is already committed, only needs to wash his feet. They need to address the things that are wrong in their life. Verse 12 says, when he had washed their feet and taken his garments, he sat down and said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, for you say, well so. For if then your teacher and Lord have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet." What does that mean, that we should also wash one another's feet? This is something that Jesus wants us to continually do until he comes again. You know, this foot washing that we're about to partake of has a multifaceted layer. I remember when I was part of the church years ago that I would avoid this foot washing like the plague. I would sit up there and I'd maybe walk outside to go to the toilet. I didn't want to partake of this because I understood it as a humbling service, and I wasn't humbled by this service. I had no trouble getting down on my knees and washing someone's feet, but it didn't really mean anything to me because I thought, that's a custom back then. They were washing because their feet were dirty and they needed to be cleaned. Is that what Jesus is addressing here? This is not what Jesus was addressing. He was showing a far spiritual lesson. Yes, they needed to be humbled, but they also needed to address the faults in their own lives and to help address each other's faults as well, and to forgive and to love like Jesus loved. We find later on in this passage that in verse 18 it said, "I do not speak concerning all of you. I know whom I have chosen, but that the scriptures may be fulfilled. He who eats bread with me has lifted up his heel against me." Jesus knew that one of them was going to do this despicable act of selling out Jesus for his own financial gain. How did Jesus feel about him? Well, as we read down, we get to verse 21, and it tells us in verse 21, when Jesus said these things, he was troubled in spirit and testified, "Most assuredly I say unto you, one of you will betray me." Here in verse 21 is telling us that Jesus was troubled in his spirit. He was troubled deep down. Why was he troubled deep down? Because one of his own, who was not really his own. John later tells us he was stealing from the treasury, he was doing all these things, he was just trying to gain favour for himself. And he sold out Jesus, and yet Jesus was troubled within him over Judas. Jesus here is loving the unlovable. And when it says here at the beginning, he loved them to the end, he loved Judas right to the very end, and it ached within his heart when Judas walked out that time. The disciples wanted to know who it was, and Matthew reveals that they all come to him and they said, "Lord, is it I? Lord, is it I?" They were a little bit troubled. Could it actually be me? Because they started to realise that they weren't perfect within themselves. Could I actually do this to you, Lord? And after they had all gone through and said, "Lord, is it I? Lord, is it I?" Judas was a bit left out there and he hadn't said anything, and so he turns around and he says, "Rabbi, is it I?" He doesn't call him Lord, just calls him teacher, because he's not. And he says, "It is as you have spoken." Jesus knew what was going to happen. He revealed that to Judas, because this was his last plea to try and reach out to Judas to change his mind. This passage in John 13 is about two Simons. One betrayed and the other denied. And yet Jesus loved them both to the end. Jesus tried to reach out to both of them, and he showed them the full extent of his love. And so that's why he says in verse 14, "If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done. Most assuredly I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who is sent greater than he who him sent. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them." So we should look at this service as an opportunity to love, as an opportunity to encourage, as an opportunity to join closer together with each other and to love those that you find hard to love. Often we go and I'm going to pick someone I'm comfortable going down to wash their feet with. I want to try and suggest to you today that you don't normally pick the same person that you normally do. That you go to someone that you might find hard to love. And I don't want you to all think because they've asked that person that they're hard to love, because you might have no one that's hard to love. And so it's not revealing that. But what I'm saying is, Jesus gave us a new commandment. This new commandment, this passage finishes in there with Jesus in verse 34, as we said before, a new command I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you. What was new to them that was still old was the way that he loved us. That's the way that Jesus wants us to love others. What's our theme for this year? It's time to act. I'm glad a few people still remembered. Our theme is it's time to act. And what I want to suggest to you, it's time to love as Jesus loved. If we loved how Jesus loved, there wouldn't be any spare seats in this place. We would have to have 2 services. But Jesus wants us to see this new commandment. That this new commandment is actually an old commandment. But it was new because Jesus modelled it to his disciples. John saw that. And he picked out 2 Simons. And he used their name Simon in it to make us to realise that, hey, he was picking out the 2 that could be seen as the worst. But one's heart was good. One's heart still wanted to be connected with Jesus, but he just wasn't fully understanding or grasping. But despite what they were about to do, Jesus loved them to the end. As we break up for communion and we start to wash each other's feet, pray that we will love as Jesus loved. And look for someone, maybe not if you haven't got someone that's hard to love, but look for someone that you can actually encourage and help in their journey as well. I invite you to break up. Now, we've got in the hall, we've got the ladies and couples and the men.